In August of 1889, every builder on the Red River Prairie was racing the frost. One man raised a cabin, another patched a roof, another dragged cottonwood logs into a stack and called it preparation. But Clara Bexley was doing something no one in Pembina County could explain. She had already finished a house. From the road it looked complete. Outer walls squared, roof shingled, windows fitted, door hung true. A person could have swept the floor, carried in a stove, and survived a decent autumn inside it. Instead, Clara walked through that finished shell with a bundle of pine studs on her shoulder, and began building a second house inside the first. Not a partition, not a pantry, not a room. A house. 20 inches inside the first set of walls, she raised another complete frame. Its own floor, its own ceiling, its own roof line, its own doorway. Between the two houses, she left a continuous band of empty air, sealed from the ground sill to the ridge. The men on the cart road slowed their teams to stare. Nobody asked her what she was doing. Asking would have required admitting they did not know. And out there, in a country where a man's worth was measured by what he could build before winter took the light away, few men were willing to confess confusion to a woman with a hammer in her hand. Clara was 39 years old. She had gray already showing at the temples, wrists roped from years of lifting wet timber, and a way of looking at a board that made the board seem as if it had better behave. She did not build to embarrass anybody. She built because cold had rules, and she had learned them in a place where being wrong did not make you uncomfortable. It ruined you. Before the prairie, before the farm claim, before the winter that would make half the county come to her door, Clara had worked on the west shore of Lake Michigan, building ice storage houses for fish merchants and dairymen. There were no electric compressors in those buildings, no machines humming in the dark. Only winter ice cut from the lake, stacked in deep rooms, and held against July by the intelligence of the walls around it. A bad ice house did not fail politely. It sweated. It stank. It turned blocks of clean winter into puddles under the plank floor, and it took a man's season with it. At 27, Clara had been taken on by an old ice house carpenter named Ira Lunt, a narrow, bent man whose hands had curled around a lifetime of cold tools. He did not talk much, because men who had learned from failure rarely wasted words. One June afternoon, he walked her into an ice store that was losing its inventory. The wall was nearly 3 feet thick, packed with timber and sawdust. To anyone passing by, it looked solid enough to stop a cannon shot. Inside, the ice was dying. Water ran in little shining threads between the blocks. The floor had gone slick. The room smelled sour. Lunt took Clara's hand and pressed her palm flat against the inside wall. It was warm. Not hot, not dramatic, just warm enough to be guilty. That, he said, is what a thick wall does when a man asks it to do the wrong job. Then he took her next door to a smaller house built with 2 skins of wood and a narrow dead space between them. Its walls looked weaker. Its timber cost less. Any heavy wall carpenter would have laughed at it. Inside, the ice stood hard and clear. Lunt tapped the inner wall with 2 knuckles. Wood carries heat, he told her. Slowly, yes, but it carries it. Give heat enough time, and it will walk through every inch of timber you own. Then he pointed into the gap. Air is worthless when it moves, but when you trap it so still it cannot climb, fall, or wander, it becomes the cheapest wall God ever allowed a poor man to use. Clara built 19 ice houses after that. Every one had 2 skins. Every one had sealed dead space. Every one held ice deeper into the season than the thick-walled houses built by men who trusted mass more than measurement. For 12 years, she had used still air to keep summer out. She had never needed to ask whether the same silence could keep winter in. Then her husband, Miles Bexley, bought into the talk of Dakota land. Black soil, open sky, a claim for those willing to arrive before the comfortable people did. They came west with 3 children, 2 trunks, a few tools, and enough saved money to build one ordinary house. Clara built that first house exactly the way her neighbors built theirs. 8 inches of pine, locked tight, a low roof, a central stove, good joints, good work, no tricks. She did it because she was not a gambler. Before she trusted an old lakeshore principle against a prairie winter, she wanted to see what the local method could survive. The winter of 1887 answered her. The house did not leak, the stove did not fail, the joints did not open, and still the cold came through. It did not rush through a crack, it did not whistle under a door. It walked through the logs themselves, slow and steady, drawing the warmth away faster than Miles could split wood to replace it. At 2 in the morning, with the stove roaring red, Clara laid her hand against the inside wall and felt the pine stealing heat out of the room. It was the ice house again. Only reversed. The thing she had spent 12 years keeping out had changed direction and was now taking food, sleep, and breath from her children. By March, they had burned almost 8 cords of wood. Miles had cut until his palms split. Their youngest, Eli, coughed in his sleep through most of February. Their daughter May did her sums sitting so close to the stove, her braids smelled faintly singed. Jonas, 13 and proud, stopped complaining because he had noticed his father looking at the woodpile the way a man looks at a debt collector. Clara felt the shame of it more sharply than any of them. She had built that house. Her hands had squared the corners. Her eye had chosen the logs. Her skill had failed to keep her children warm. But the failure was useful because it told the truth. This was not bad carpentry. It was bad physics. By the next autumn, Clara had a ledger beside the stove. Every morning she wrote the outside temperature, the inside temperature, the number of times the stove had been fed, the frost on the walls, the direction of the wind. All winter she let that ordinary cabin punish them, and all winter she measured the punishment. By spring, she knew what she would build. By late July of 1889, she began. The outer shell went up first, 25 feet by 19, framed from river pine and sheaved against the prairie wind. The roof was pitched sharper than any roof on that road, not for beauty, but because snow has weight, and Clara had no interest in letting a North Dakota storm sit comfortably over her children. From the outside, it looked like a sensible farmhouse. A little broad, perhaps, a little expensive, but nothing a person could not understand. The strange part lived inside. 20 inches from every outer wall, she raised the second frame. The inner house measured 21 by 15. It did not touch the outer house anywhere. Not at the walls, not at the floor, not in the ceiling, not beneath the roof. Clara braced it as its own independent body, a warm box standing inside a weather box. Between them ran a hidden passage of air. No stove would heat it, no person would live in it, no shelf would be hung there, no sensible man would have paid for it. And that was the point. The air had to do nothing. On the 5th day of the inner frame, Captain Amos Reddick arrived. No one in the county called him Captain because he still held a command. They called him Captain because he had once supervised railroad trestles across 2 states and had kept the title by wearing certainty like a coat. He was 56, broad through the chest, white beard trimmed square, boots polished even in mud. He knew beams, loads, spans, braces, and foundations. More importantly, he knew that everyone else knew he knew. Reddick walked into Clara's half-finished house without waiting to be invited. He looked at the outer wall. He looked at the inner studs. Then he looked at Miles. "Did you approve this?" Miles had a mallet in his hand. He said nothing. The captain rapped the empty space with the end of his cane, as if nothing might answer. "A wall works because it resists," he said. "It resists by substance. Timber, stone, earth, weight. You have paid for 2 walls and placed the weakest possible material between them." He turned to Clara then. "Nothing." Clara wiped pine dust from her fingers. "Not nothing," she said. "Air." "Air does not hold a house." "No, it holds temperature if you keep it still." Reddick's mouth tightened into something almost kind, which made it worse. "Madam, whatever trick kept fish from spoiling by a lake has no place in a prairie winter. Cold here does not politely stand outside your theory. It comes for a building with force." "And heat leaves one by law," Clara said. That made several of the men at the road chuckle, though none of them could have said exactly what was funny. Reddick put his hat back on. "I have watched green settlers waste timber. I have never seen one build a mistake with this much confidence." By evening, Nolan's store knew. By the next market day, the county had improved the story for itself. The Bexley woman was building a house with a hallway nobody could enter. The Bexley woman believed empty space was warmer than wood. The Bexley woman had built a box for her house to die inside. Bram Coyle, Clara's nearest neighbor, supplied the line that traveled farthest. "It is like sewing a winter coat and leaving the stuffing out." People loved that. They laughed with their elbows on the counter at Nolan's because the comparison felt plain and clever and safe. They repeated it until even children at the schoolhouse knew it. May heard it first from a girl in a red wool hood who asked whether her family planned to sleep in the crack between the houses. Jonas hit a boy behind the livery stable for saying his mother had built a coffin big enough to farm in. Little Eli asked Miles one night whether their new house was foolish. Miles looked across the table at Clara, and she looked back at him, and neither of them gave the child the answer they wished they had. Because there was fear in that house, not the loud kind, the arithmetic kind. Clara had spent nearly all of their savings. Miles had borrowed against the next wheat crop to pay for extra timber, tarred canvas, lime, oakum, and iron straps. The new house had cost $640 before the stovepipe was even set, nearly twice what a common claim house would have cost. The county could laugh for free. The Bexleys had paid in advance. One August night, after the children were asleep, Miles unfolded Clara's drawings on the table and kept his hand flat on the corner of the page as if the paper might escape. What if the lake taught you wrong for this place? He did not say it cruelly. That was what made it hurt. Clara looked at the drawing for a long time before she answered. "The lake did not teach me cold," she said. "It taught me heat. Heat has only one habit, Miles. It moves from where there is more of it to where there is less. Summer into ice, room into winter. The direction changes. The law does not. Are you certain? No. The lamp gave a small pop. No builder is certain before the season tests the work, but I am less uncertain than every man laughing at us. Miles wanted comfort. Clara gave him truth. He had loved her too long not to know the difference. So he nodded, and she saw what the nod cost him. September was spent sealing. The outer shell had one job: stop the wind from entering the hidden space. Clara caulked each joint with oakum and lime. She sealed around window bucks, rafters, sills, and corners. A bad gap would turn the airspace into a flue. Moving air would carry heat away faster than a solid wall ever could. The inner shell had the harder job: keep the family's warmth inside the rooms. Clara laid tarred canvas under the inner cladding, lapped like roof shingles so drafts could not creep upward. She packed clay mortar with horsehair so the seams could flex without cracking in deep cold. She framed the inner roof separately, leaving the same dead space overhead that ran through the walls. Every inch mattered. The men who passed saw only slowness. They saw her spending days on seams nobody would see, fussing over a space nobody would use, making a house more expensive by making part of it empty. By the first week of October, the double house was closed. From the road, it looked almost ordinary. That was the most dangerous thing about it. Its real work was hidden. On the night before the family moved in, Clara took a lantern and walked alone through the airspace. The outer wall to her left had gone cold with evening. The inner wall to her right still held the day's warmth from a small cooking fire. She set a thermometer in the gap and waited. Outside, the prairie read 29 degrees. Inside the airspace, it read 47. Inside the rooms, without a steady fire yet, it held 55. Clara stood in the narrow passage, lantern smoke curling above her head, and listened. Nothing moved. No draft, no whisper. No living current of air climbing where it should not. The house held its breath. For the first time in months, Clara smiled. But numbers written in a woman's ledger had no power at Nolan's store. The county wanted winter. It wanted a verdict it could feel on its face. A betting page opened behind Nolan's counter. By the end of October, $92 had been laid against Clara Bexley's Silent Wall house. The most common prediction was that she would tear open the inner boards by Christmas. Once she discovered she was heating a useless pocket around her rooms. Captain Reddick put down $15 himself. "A house is not a lantern," he told the room. "You do not save flame by putting glass around glass." Everyone nodded because it sounded like engineering. November came mild. The first snows slid from Clara's steep roof in white slabs, exactly as she had planned. The airspace settled into a pattern, 15, 18, sometimes 20 degrees warmer than outside, even when the stove inside was barely fed. Clara's ledger filled. Outside, void. Inside, wood burned. 4 columns, straight as fence wire. The county did not read them. Across the road, the old kind of houses began their usual winter work. Stoves burned all day. Frost feathered the inside corners at dawn. Men added another log, then another, and called it the price of the country. That phrase had done more damage than any storm. The price of the country. It made waste sound like weather. It made bad design sound like courage. It made exhaustion respectable. Captain Reddick rode past the Bexley place one afternoon and saw only a small fire through the window. He reported at Nolan's that Clara was already rationing. "She is afraid to burn what she needs," he said. "The empty space is eating her fuel." But the truth was exactly opposite. The stove burned low because the rooms did not need much. A small flame in a correct house can look like poverty to a man who only understands roaring fires. In early December, May asked the question better than any adult had. "If the air does the keeping," she said, "why doesn't the air outside keep us warm, too?" Clara took 2 scraps of pine and a sheet of brown paper from a flour sack. She set one board on the table and had Eli put his palm against it while she held the other end near the stove. Warmth traveled through. Then she set the 2 boards apart, with the paper loosely tented between them, not touching flat, just creating a pocket that could not stir. Eli put his palm against the far board again. This time, almost nothing came through. "It is not air by itself," Clara said. "It is air caught and made quiet. Outside air is busy. It runs, climbs, falls, steals. Dead air has nowhere to take the warmth." May's eyes sharpened. "So our house is wearing quiet." Clara looked at her daughter and felt the phrase land truer than half the county's engineering. "Yes," she said, "that is close." Their house was wearing quiet. That became the private name for it inside the family. The quiet around the rooms. The quiet between the walls. The quiet that did what solid timber could not. Then January arrived. On the 6th day of the month, the sky cleared in a hard, beautiful blue that fooled only people new to that country. By afternoon, the wind had turned north. By sundown, horses stood with ice in their lashes. By midnight, the thermometer outside Nolan's store read 28 below. By dawn, it read 39 below. The cold did not feel like weather anymore. It felt like a hand. It found hinges, nails, window glass, water buckets, boot leather. It took the warmth out of iron so fiercely that touching a latch with bare skin could leave flesh behind. Breath froze in mustaches. Chores became calculations of how long a body could remain outside and still come back as a body. The cold held for 9 days. In ordinary winters, a stove needed feeding every few hours. That week, many houses demanded wood every 90 minutes. Men who had stacked confidently in October now counted their piles at noon and again at dusk, as if fear might slow the disappearing rows. The county's proud, solid walls turned traitor. Frost formed on the inside faces of logs. Bedrooms were abandoned. Children slept in kitchens. Women wrapped quilts around chairbacks to make smaller rooms inside the rooms. Old people stopped undressing to sleep. On the 3rd night, a bachelor named Niels Harlan was found frozen in his bed 2 miles north of the church road. His stove had gone cold. His wood had run out. The inside of his window was furred with ice thick enough to dull the daylight. He had built a good house by every rule the county honored. That was the terror of it. The old rules were being obeyed, and people were still losing. 2 days later, Martha Rusk collapsed between her woodshed and her door while carrying an armload of split ash. Her husband, Otis Rusk, was inside feeding the stove. He did not hear her over the wind. Otis was a carpenter. He had laughed at Clara in October and called her air gap a framed-up absence. Now his wife lay in the snow, 22 steps from a house he had built exactly the way he believed a house should be built. That same week, Clara's inner rooms held 60 degrees. Not hot, not luxurious, simply livable. The stove took small wood 3 times a day, morning, late afternoon, before bed. Jonas repaired a harness strap at the table in his shirt sleeves. May read beside the window without frost creeping across the glass. Eli played checkers on the floor and complained only when Jonas refused to lose. Clara wrote the numbers down. Outside, 36 below. Airspace, 48 above. Inside, 61. Wood burned since yesterday, 2 small armloads and 1 split log. She stared at the figures longer than she needed to. The ledger no longer felt like proof. It felt like accusation. Because a quarter-mile away, people were feeding fires like sacrifices and still losing warmth through the walls. On the morning of the 7th cold day, Clara went out to split smaller kindling, not because the pile was low, because the stove worked best with a modest fire, and a modest fire is a luxury in a country where everyone else is fighting for flame. Captain Reddick saw her from the road. He was riding to ask Nolan about buying cordwood on credit. At 35 below, Clara Bexley stood beside a deep wood pile, splitting kindling with unhurried strokes. The sight bothered him more than any argument she had made. A person in danger does not split wood carefully. A person in danger burns whatever fits. That image followed him home. He entered his own front room and found his wife, Lenora, seated 3 feet from a roaring stove with a shawl around her shoulders and another over her knees. His daughter had slept in a chair so she could wake to feed the fire. The far wall wore frost. The room smelled of smoke and wet wool and fatigue. Reddick stood there with his gloves still on. For the first time in 56 years, a question rose in him that did not feel like weakness. What if I am wrong? Not about trestles, not about bridges, not about load, about warmth, about the thing so simple he had never investigated it. He had assumed thick meant safe, because thick had always meant strong. He had carried a bridge builder's religion into a house builder's problem. A bridge asks material to bear weight. A winter house asks material to slow heat. Those are not the same question, and he had answered one with the other. That night, Reddick fed the stove at 11, at 1, at 3, and again before dawn. Each time Lenora opened her eyes and watched the wood go in with the blank attention of someone watching money burn after the bank has closed. Near morning, with the fire down to coals and his own breath visible indoors, he made his decision. He would go to Clara Bexley, not to inspect her failure, to stand inside his own. The next morning broke at 37 below, bright enough to look innocent. Reddick rode to the Bexley place with his scarf pulled over his mouth and no speech prepared. Pride, he discovered, had many rehearsals. Humility had none. Clara met him at the door. "You picked a sharp morning to call, Captain." "I needed to see the space," he said. She opened the outer door. Winter wind cuts off as the door closed, and stopped. It was not warm like a room with a stove. It was warm in a way he did not have a word for. The cold had been removed. The bite had been blunted. The air around him was quiet enough that he could hear the small creak of the lantern hook above Clara's shoulder. He pulled a thermometer from his coat pocket. He always carried one. He had never been more afraid of an instrument. 49 degrees. Between 2 unheated walls. With the prairie outside near 40 below. He looked at the mercury line as if it had betrayed him personally. "It has held there most of the week," Clara said. "A little lower at night, a little higher when the sun touches the outer boards. The inner wall never meets the weather directly. That is the whole trick." Reddick looked around the narrow space. There was no trick to see. That was the trick. They passed through the inner door. The kitchen stood at 60 degrees. A small flame moved behind the stove door. Not a furnace roar, not a desperate blaze. A working flame, no larger than it needed to be. May was copying figures into a slate. Jonas sat with a knife and a piece of pine. Eli was asleep under a thin blanket on a bench by the wall. No frost, no smoke haze, no one dressed for survival inside their own home. Reddick did not speak for a long time. His mind moved over the room the way his eyes once moved over a damaged trestle, looking for the load path, the failure point, the hidden member carrying what no one saw. At last he asked, "How much wood?" Clara opened the ledger. "In these 9 days, a little over a third of a cord." Reddick closed his eyes. He had burned almost 2.5. His rooms had stayed colder. "I told men you were building nonsense," he said. Clara did not answer. "I put money against you." Still she said nothing. "I made it easier for fools to laugh." Clara shut the ledger gently. "The cold did not ask your permission before it came, and it did not ask mine before it spared this house. That is generous. It is accurate." He looked at her then, and something in his face had lost its iron. "Niels Harlan is dead," he said. "Martha Rusk, too." Clara's hands went still on the ledger. She had not heard. For a moment, the warm room seemed to contract around her. Martha, who had once passed the Bexley place with Otis and stared at the inner frame as if Clara had taken leave of sense. Martha, who had sent May home with preserves after the child scraped her knee on the school road. Martha, who had been alive in a cold house, because cold houses were what everyone had always accepted. Clara sat down. Reddick remained standing, ashamed now of more than being wrong. "If I had listened in September, no," Clara said, and the word came sharper than she meant. Then softer. "No, do not make yourself the whole cause. That is pride wearing mourning clothes." He took the blow because it was deserved. "The future, then," he said. Clara looked up. "What about it?" "Teach me enough that I can build it right when the ground opens. Teach Rusk if he will come. Teach any man who has sense enough left to be ashamed." Miles, who had been silent beside the stove, stood and poured coffee into a tin cup. He set it in front of Reddick. It was not forgiveness, not exactly. It was the courtesy one builder gives another who has walked into a hard truth and not turned away. Reddick held the cup with both hands, as if warmth itself had become evidence. By the end of that day, he left with 6 pages of notes in Clara's tight handwriting. Outer shell, inner shell, minimum airspace, roof separation, sill ceiling, tarred canvas laps, mortar mix, the danger of convection, the uselessness of an unsealed gap. He folded the pages inside his coat. The man who had mocked empty space rode home carrying instructions on how to build it. News traveled strangely after that. No one announced that Clara had been right. That would have required too much dignity at once. Instead, men found reasons to pass by. A broken harness, a message for Miles, a question about seed, a borrowed auger. Each one somehow ended up standing in the airspace, looking at Clara's thermometer. 48, 50, 47. Then stepping into the kitchen. 60, 61. Then looking at the small stove flame. That was the part that silenced them, not the numbers alone, not Clara's explanation, not even Reddick's conversion. The small fire did it. The county had been taught to measure winter by the size of the flame required to endure it. Clara's house showed them a smaller flame, and forced them to ask a more painful question. How much of their suffering had been necessary? At Nolan's store, the betting page disappeared from the ledger. Nolan returned the $92 in small, folded packets. "I will not keep winnings from a wager about whether children froze," he told Bram Coyle. No one argued. Bram came to Clara in February, hat low, voice plain. "If I build an outer shell around my house come spring, will it help?" "Half as well as building right from the start," Clara said, "but half is not nothing." He glanced toward her walls. "I suppose I have learned not to insult nothing." Otis Rusk came later. Not in February, not in March. Grief does not move on other people's schedule. He came in May, when the thaw had turned the yard to black mud, and meadowlarks were making an absurdly cheerful noise from fence posts. Otis stopped at Clara's gate and did not step through. She went to him. He held his hat in both hands so tightly the brim bent. "I built the house she died beside," he said. Clara waited. "I chose the logs. I cut the joints. I told myself there was not a warmer house within 10 miles because I had used good timber and more of it than most." He swallowed. "I called your work a framed-up absence." The phrase lay between them, ugly and exact. Then he said, "I have 20 years of building left in my hands. I cannot put Martha back in her kitchen, but I can stop building walls that take warmth from other men's wives." There was no victory in that moment, only cost. Clara took him to the house and taught him from the beginning, not the pretty version, not the version that made him feel forgiven. She showed him why a thick log slows heat but does not stop it. She showed him how an air gap fails if wind enters at the sill. She showed him how an unsealed vertical channel becomes a chimney, carrying warm air upward and drawing cold below. She showed him the inner canvas, the lapped seams, the separate roof, the way a house can be strong without asking every part of it to be solid. Otis listened as if each word had a weight. After that spring, he never built another single-wall house. By the fall of 1890, 6 families on that road had added outer shells or built new double-skin houses. Reddick oversaw 2 of them. Otis built 3. Bram Coyle, who had once joked about a coat without stuffing, told every man who visited his new wall that quiet air was the only stuffing worth paying for. Clara never named the method after herself. She did not have to. People did that strange thing they do when a truth becomes useful. They stopped calling it strange. They called it sensible, then standard, then obvious. Within 10 years, nobody in that part of the county wanted a new house without a dead air space. Within 20, builders who had never heard Clara's name were arguing over the best width of the cavity, as if the idea had descended from heaven already respectable. Her daughter May remembered everything. She remembered the ledger, the cold week, the men pretending they had only come to borrow tools, the way Captain Reddick's face looked when the thermometer told him no lie he could talk over. May became the one who explained the method to visitors when Clara was busy. At 12, she stood before grown men and said, "Wood is not warmth. It is only a road warmth can travel on. Mother builds places where the road ends." Men who would not have taken correction from Clara in September took instruction from her daughter in June, because winter had removed their pride piece by piece, and what remained had use for truth. The Bexley house stood for 58 years. It survived blizzards, droughts, 2 roof replacements, a new stove, and the arrival of neighbors Clara could never have imagined. Telephone poles, motor cars, tractors, electric lines. In 1912, Jonas added a back room and followed his mother's rules exactly, leaving the hidden band of quiet air unbroken around the addition. In 1931, May brought her own children there during a February storm and found the old rooms still easier to heat than the newer houses in town. By the time the house came down in 1947, factory-made wall panels had begun arriving by rail. They used different materials, cleaner language, and printed diagrams. 2 faces, a sealed gap, trapped air held motionless, or filled with insulation to prevent motion even further. The trade had a name for it by then: cavity construction, a phrase smooth enough for books. But the principle had not changed. The warmest material in Clara's house was the one everyone had laughed at because they could not see how it worked. Not the pine, not the tar, not the canvas, not the stove. The quiet. Clara Bexley died in 1924. Her obituary called her a farmer's wife, a mother of 3, and a respected resident of Pembina County. It mentioned her church. It mentioned her garden. It mentioned Miles, who had died 4 years earlier. It did not mention the winter she changed the way her neighbors built shelter. Newspapers often miss the important thing when the important thing looks like work. But on the day she was buried, 6 families from the old road placed small bundles of split kindling along her fence. No card, no speech, just wood, cut fine enough for a modest fire. That was the memorial her story deserved, not because wood had saved them, because less of it had needed to. Captain Reddick had been right about bridges. Otis Rusk had been right about joints. Bram Coyle had been right about money. None of them were fools. They were faithful to the wrong lesson. They believed solid meant safe, because in many parts of life it does. A solid beam matters. A solid promise matters. A solid floor beneath your children matters. But not every problem is solved by more of the thing you can hold in your hands. Sometimes more mass is only a slower failure. Sometimes the empty place, arranged correctly, does what substance cannot. That is why the county had resisted Clara so fiercely. Her house did not merely suggest a better wall, it accused every old wall of wasting heat, labor, money, and in one brutal week, lives. People rarely hate a new idea because it is foolish. They hate it because, if it is true, their old certainty becomes expensive. Clara carried the truth into that county, from a melting ice room on Lake Michigan, from an old man who had pressed her hand against a warm wall and taught her that heat moves whether tradition approves or not. She brought it to the Prairie. She built it while men laughed. She paid for it before anyone believed her. She held her nerve through the ledger, the betting page, the borrowed money, her husband's honest fear, her daughter's tears, and the long first season when the only thing standing between her family and ruin was 20 inches of air nobody respected. Then January came down from the north and judged every house without caring who had built it. The solid walls lost warmth. The loudest men lost certainty. The hidden air stayed quiet. And in the house everyone called empty, Clara Bexley's children slept warm.